Hello everyone, and welcome to this video about growing food during pandemics. How to grow food during times of crisis and quarantines with a focus on hydroponics. This presentation was prepared by me, Henrique Sanchez, and my colleague Martin Basterrechea, and we are part of an organization called Ponic Labs, where we try to teach people how to grow more food, particularly with hydroponic techniques. This presentation was made on March 2020. As you all know, we are currently living through a pandemic, and during this pandemic, me and my colleague thought that we have so much knowledge about how to grow food that there must be a way that we can make that knowledge more useful and more available for people. Um, Also, for people to take these difficult times we're living in and use it as an opportunity to grow more food. So to start with this video, I would like to share this quote by Peter Brian Medawar. And it says, "A virus is a piece of bad news wrapped up in a protein." Now, we chose this quote because, yes, a virus is indeed a piece of bad news, and it will bring a lot of bad things with it. But on the other hand, it is also an opportunity for us to change our behaviors and to be more creative. In this way, we think that growing our own food even more, especially during this time, is an important thing. And of course, there are many ways to grow food, and here are the main ways we believe that we can grow food, and these are the ways that are most relevant for the presentation or this video that I will be doing today. So first of all, we have, of course, soil cultivation that everybody knows about, also known as geoponics. And the main way we grow food today is through intensive agriculture. On the other hand, there is also a more traditional way of growing food that is becoming more and more also, it's increasing also in today's world because of sustainability concerns, and that is, of course, organic agriculture, also known as ecological agriculture or biological agriculture. And permaculture is part of that type of agriculture as well, which is a type of cultivation you may have heard about. Now, on the other hand, we have the more recent type of cultivation, which is soilless cultivation, also known as hydroponics. And there are two main types of hydroponics. The first one is mineral hydroponics, the one that most people probably have heard about. This is a type of soilless cultivation where we take mineral salts and we grow the plants without any soil whatsoever. Here we have two subcategories, active and passive, and this is for the future part of the video where I will talk a bit more in detail about it. But in contrast to the mineral hydroponics, we have the organic hydroponics, which has started to grow also as a sort of sustainability concern for mineral hydroponics. And by far the biggest type of organic hydroponics out there is aquaponics. Aquaponics is where we grow fish and plants together in a sort of ecosystem. And here we have coupled and decoupled also as a subcategory, and that's more of a curiosity. But basically, coupled is most of aquaponic systems are coupled in the sense that the water flow and the nutrient flow is continuously being recirculated. Whereas with decoupled aquaponics, we separate the flows a bit, and that way we can optimize the parts, either the fish part or the plant part. We can also grow a bit more because we have a bit more control. Next, in organic hydroponics, we have two subcategories, and these are emerging fields, I would say. They're more experimental fields. Bioponics essentially means, at least to us, that you take some sort of waste product that's organic in nature and you transform it through some process into a nutrient solution that you can then use as you would use a normal hydroponic solution. And lastly, the subcategory of organic hydroponics that I have personally focused the most in is anthroponics, where we use human urine to grow food. Again, like aquaponics, this can be both coupled and decoupled, and I will talk about this further ahead in the video. In this video, however, we will be focusing more on hydroponics because we believe it is more efficient in terms of cultivation output and time, and also in terms of water savings. And the issue with the time, it takes less time to grow in hydroponics, is because plants don't have to spend so much time and energy to search for the water and the nutrients as they would otherwise need on the soil. Because we already make it so available for them, they don't have to spend so much time and energy to get what they need. So now let's go a bit into detail of these different types of cultivation so you get a bit more of an idea of what we are talking about. The first one is, of course, intensive agriculture, and most people are familiar with this. They have seen the fields, sometimes endless fields of monocrop culture. And the way it works basically is that you take energy and you also extract minerals from the earth, and then you add this to the soil in order to increase the output. So for example, you use something called the Haber-Bosch process to extract nitrogen from the air and make it available as a fertilizer. And then you also do mineral extraction to get industrial fertilizer. And then you have all the nutrients you need and you add them to the soil. Then you add the water, the light, the intensive agriculture, and the food. To note in this setup, in this flow chart I've made, is that parts of this intensive agriculture are not visible to the farmer. So the farmer doesn't necessarily concern itself with how the fertilizer gets to him. He just buys it and then he uses it. And in different methods, this source of nutrients will be more connected to the farmer or less connected to the farmer, as is in this case. But in intensive agriculture, the energy factor and the mineral extraction is a big factor, but this also allows for a much bigger quantity of food to be produced and also a more homogeneous amount of food. Next, we have organic agriculture, also known as ecological agriculture and biological agriculture and permaculture. This photo in particular is a picture I took when I visited an organic farm in Bristol, England. And as you can already see, there's much more variety in the farm. There's a much more, both in terms of color and plants and the whole setup of how the plants are positioned to each other. Sometimes there's not a clear distinction when one plant ends and another begins, or when one crop ends and one begins. And the way it works basically is that we start with a waste product, which can be food leftovers, and that organic waste, then using microorganisms and biological processes in the soil, allows the waste to be transformed into nutrients that the plants can absorb. And then, of course, we add the water, then we have the light, and then we get our food. In the case of organic agriculture, the farmer may have that biological process, that organic waste transformation, incorporated in the location where the plants are growing, or on the other hand, they can have it like separated. So they transform the waste into soil in one part, then they move that soil and then they plant on that soil. In contrast to the previous cultivation method, the intensive agriculture, here the biggest issue is time. It takes more time to transform the leftovers into in a form that the nutrients are available for the plants. And also there's more manual labor. There's more things that have to be done by hand. It's not easily automated. Now we move into the soilless part of cultivation techniques. And we start with the biggest one, of course, mineral hydroponics. You can see here two pictures that I took. In the first one on the left, you can see my colleague Martin, and he's looking at the famous zip grow towers. These are vertical towers that you can use to grow hydroponically or aquaponically. And with mineral hydroponics, you could grow a big amount of food in a very short amount of time. And in this case, with the towers, you have the water always flowing through the towers, and you can also add oxygen to the water to really optimize the system. But mineral hydroponics is much more versatile than that. And to illustrate that, we have a picture of some basil that I grew in my old apartment. And as you can see, I'm growing it very simply in just old Coca-Cola bottles. So these were bottles that I reused. I added the mineral solution, and then the plant just had everything it needed to grow, and then it was just a matter of waiting and harvesting. So The system can be complex and optimized for big production, but it can also be passive in a sense that you don't need energy to add energy to the system to grow the plants that you need. On the other hand, this type of cultivation is a bit similar to the intensive agriculture in the sense that the source of the nutrients comes from a high energy source and also requires mineral extraction, which has its own complications with pollution. So in this sense, that mineral extraction then results in the mineral salts, which have the nutrients available for absorption for the mineral hydroponics. And the farmer itself, of course, has no way to produce these nutrients. He just buys the nutrient solution, adds it to his system, and then he has the water and the light, and then he gets the food. So the source of the nutrients in this sense is a bit abstracted from the farmer. So as I said already, there's a big factor of energy and extraction, but also that allows us to create a lot more food. Now, going to aquaponics, which is a type of cultivation method that I have dealt a lot with. This is the type of cultivation where you have simultaneous production of fish for human consumption and plants. On the left, you have two pictures, which was the first aquaponics system that I built in a greenhouse. Then on the top, you can see some pak choi production in a small garage in Reykjavik, Iceland. On the right, you can see some tilapia, which is one of the most commonly used fish in aquaponics because of its versatility. And that picture was taken in Las Palmas in Spain. And lastly, in the bottom right corner, you can see my own homemade system that I had at some point. And this system was very small, so I couldn't grow or produce fish for human consumption, but I can still use the fish to produce the plant. And this is, I would argue, the most complex of all systems because we have so many different organisms at play. We have the fish, we have the microorganisms, and we have the plants. Here, the only part that's really abstracted from the farmer itself is the source of the fish feed. Most farmers of aquaponics, they just buy the fish feed when it's ready, and then they add it to the fish. The fish, of course, will grow. They will grow their biomass. At some point, they will be harvested for consumption. But in the meantime, the fish are in the system, and the farmer is taking care of them. And as the fish are going about their lives, they will excrete fish waste, and this fish waste goes to some sort of special place where we can have biological processes, where we have special microorganisms that will convert the waste into nutrients for the plants. And of course, this requires some sort of energy added into the system. But all of that part is in the system that the farmer is taking care of, including also, of course, the water and the light. And then we have the plants that become food. So this system is much more complex, and of course it uses energy, but it does produce two different types of food, including animal protein, which is something that the other cultivation methods that we will see are not producing. So it's very unique in that sense. Then of course we have bioponics. Bioponics is the type of organic agriculture where we take some sort of waste process, some sort of organic waste, and we transform it into a nutrient solution that the plants can absorb. Here I have two pictures of two different systems with two different ways of sourcing the nutrients that we used. On the left, you can see we are growing lettuce, and this lettuce was grown from vermicompost leachate from food waste. And I will go a bit more into detail about that soon. And on the right side, we had basil that was growing, and this basil was grown from actual vermicompost, also from food waste. And this vermicompost was then dried and blended into a dust and mixed in the water. But overall, the point of bioponics is that you also, it's a bit similar, or it's the most similar with organic agriculture with soil, which is that you take some sort of leftovers, some sort of organic waste, and you will transform that waste using energy and biological processes and microorganisms into nutrients that are available for absorption, except in this case they are in the form of a nutrient solution rather than a nutrient-rich soil. And also in this case, the farmer will have to actively manage most of the components of this system, including the conversion of the leftover to organic waste and then into the nutrients for the plants. Now, I've already mentioned two types of ways that I have experimented with bioponics, but there is potentially more ways that can be done. And one of the ways that I know about, but I have not tested myself, is using something called the bokashi composting method. And with this method, we also take food leftovers that become organic waste, and we use some special type of microorganisms called effective microorganisms. And the biological process at work in that case, in the bokashi compost process, is anaerobic fermentation. That is, we ferment the waste without oxygen. So to go a bit more into detail about the two experiments that I mentioned in the beginning, on the first one with the lettuce, we took the food waste and then we converted that using vermicomposting. Vermicomposting is where we compost waste using a special type of worms called red worms, Eusenia fetida. And these worms, they're very effective. They convert that waste into a very nutrient-rich soil, also called humus, I think, and they produce some sort of leachate at the end that can be collected in a special container. So what we did was collect that leachate, and then we filtered the leachate for solids, and we added the leachate to the bioponic system and just fixed the pH of the water. I do have to mention, however, that this leachate is not very nutrient rich. So that's why we were mostly able to grow the lettuce, because the lettuce is a plant that doesn't require so many nutrients, as opposed to other plants like fruity vegetables. Then, on the other hand, we have the other experiment with the basil, where we took food waste and we also vermicomposted it with the worms. Then we separated the worms away from the vermicompost and we took that vermicompost and added it to an oven. We heated it up to 105 degrees Celsius and then we blended it to a fine dust. And then we added that dust and mixed it very well into the bioponic system with the water. If you are curious, you can read more details about that experiment in the link in yellow below. Now, I have an asterisk in the food waste just to mention that in the process of vermicomposting, we can't just add whatever type of organic waste we want. So some of the things that you should not add to vermicomposting include meats, bones, fat, and anything oily or greasy. You should not add dairy products including butter, sour cream, milk, whole eggs, and cheese, although you can add eggshells. You also shouldn't add canned sauces, peanut butter, and other processed food. The same goes for citrus foods like lemons, limes, and oranges. Also, you should not add onions and garlic, spicy foods such as hot peppers, yard trimmings that have been treated with pesticides, and of course, plastic, metals, glass, and other non-biodegradable items. Also, you should not add soap or paper that has a glossy finish or colored ink. And lastly, don't add poison ivy, oak, or sumac or other poisonous plants. Now we move on to anthroponics, which is one of the organic hydroponic methods that I have done the most experiments on. But before we proceed, I have a big disclaimer, which is that anthroponics is a very new field and with an associated risk. And the knowledge that I have created has not yet been peer-reviewed in an academic context. So if you are planning on trying this sort of cultivation method in the future, you should proceed at your own risk. So anthroponics, basically we take urine and we treat it in some way, and then we are able to grow plants in a hydroponic sort of way without soil. On the left, you can see one of the first anthroponic experiments that I performed. In this experiment, we grew lettuce in a small system, and this system was always continuously recirculating the processed urine and the water through the part where the plants were growing that also had a lot of the beneficial microorganisms. In contrast to that recirculating method, on the top center picture you can see basil growing, and that was grown in a decoupled anthroponic system. So here the treated urine was added to a separate nitrification process, and I will explain that later in the video. So the urine was converted, the nutrients in that urine were converted to a more plant available form. And then once a week, there was a small pump that was pumping that treated and ready urine to the plant component. So there was not a constant recirculation in that system. Then I added just a picture of urine so you can see that you can actually grow a lot in a small amount of urine, in a small volume of urine. And urine actually does have a lot of nutrients, although for some plants it's not enough just to add the nutrient. Then on the top right, you can see pak choi being grown in an NFT system and cucumber behind it. And lastly, the first anthroponic system that I did was in a farm, and you can see that in the bottom right. That was a very big system, and in this system we were able to grow cucumbers, strawberries, lettuce, herbs and salads, and of course tomatoes. Now, I already explained a bit how it works, but we take some sort of processed human urine and we add it to a place where we have microorganisms that perform biological processes. We add energy and air and oxygen, and then those nutrients that were locked away in the urine now become available for the plant. So then we have a nutrient solution that is going through the anthroponic system where the plants are and the light is and the water is. Now, of course, the farmer also has to deal with all of these steps, so nothing here is really abstracted away from the farmer as opposed to other methods. And in this case, in this type of cultivation method, we have less the time factor in the transformation of nutrients, at least compared with the traditional organic agriculture in soil. And we also have a bit less manual labor, but of course we have to add energy, and that energy is needed for the biological processes to accelerate them. Now, a bit more into detail of how the anthroponics work. We collect the human urine, and then this urine is stored for a period of minimum 5 weeks until the urea that's present in the urine becomes ammonia. And the process of storing the urine increases the pH of the liquid above 9, and that is a value that will certainly sterilize whatever microorganism that might be harmful for us may still be present. So that's why we recommend a minimum of 5 weeks. Then we add that volatilized urine to a nitrification component. So in the nitrification component, the ammonia that is now in the volatilized urine is transformed to nitrate, which is a source of nitrogen that's more plant available. Finally, we transport the nitrified urine to the plant component. So I have a little star in the human urine part, and that is to say that we recommend that we should only source urine from someone that is healthy and also preferably male. And we say male because with female there is a risk of some sort of blood also being present in the urine. But of course, if someone is careful, it is also possible to grow plants using or sourcing urine from females. But also more important is that the healthy person we are sourcing the urine from, should not be using any source of medication or any hormone treatment. And this is because we still don't know if that medication or that hormone treatment can go through the urine into the plant and then be absorbed and accumulated in the plant, so then when we consume the plant, there might be a negative health risk for us. And I also have a little star here in the storage of the urine. And this is because there is a way to minimize or to reduce that time of storage to basically nothing by adding some sort of enzyme. And we have found that if you mix watermelon seeds that have been crushed and dehusked to the urine, then you basically don't have to wait, because there is this enzyme in the seeds that will accelerate the transformation of the urea into ammonia in the urine. And of course, if you are more interested in reading about all of these experiments that have led to this knowledge, you can see here a list of all of them. So first, there's the first system, which was part of my master thesis, where we grew a lot of different crops in a very complex system. Then we had the lettuce experiment, where we were able to grow a lot of lettuce with very little amount of urine. Then we tried growing cucumber, and we tried different concentrations of urine. Then we had the experiment where we tried to accelerate the storage of urine so we wouldn't have to wait so much by adding these watermelon seeds that I mentioned. Then we also researched a bit if wood ash could be added as a supplement to the growth of cucumber, because just adding the urine was not enough to grow the cucumber. And lastly, we had the experiment with the decoupled anthroponics, where we don't have a continuous recirculation of the urine through the plant component. So now we go into the different phases of a pandemic. And of course, when we say different phases, here we are now living through a pandemic, and the different descriptions that I have for each phase, it's not for sure that we will live through these, but these are a hypothetical pandemic, a pandemic where we will face very difficult times indeed. So we are kind of simulating, okay, if we have these certain phases, what are the conditions that are a characteristic of each phase, and how will that affect how we grow the plants, how we cultivate them? So, in the beginning of a pandemic, we have constant access to energy and resources. And in some rural areas, we might have just intermittent energy, but still constant access to resources. There is still few information about the virus, and the first travel restriction measures have just been enacted or imposed. Then we go into the peak of a pandemic. Here we still have constant energy, but we begin to have some intermittent access to resources. General quarantines and high movement restrictions start to be applied. So that means we can only move for essential services. And of course, there will be occasional supermarket shortages for some products. But as we move through the peak of a pandemic, we also start to witness intermittent energy and almost no resources. This is because we will have heavily affected supply chains and shortage of some basic food in supermarkets. Towards the end of a pandemic, we would expect that we would have basically no resources and no energy. At the same time, we will have a very high number of infected people, which means there will be a lack of workers, even for essential services like agriculture, health, and energy. However, there is a light in the end of the tunnel, and the recovery is beginning. So these are different phases of the pandemic, and we have written here for you what we think is the priority of cultivation methods that you should apply depending on which phase of the pandemic you find yourself in. So, in the beginning of a pandemic where we still have constant resources and energy, you should prioritize complex methods like aquaponics and methods that require more resources and energy, which is aquaponics and active mineral hydroponics. These two in particular because aquaponics you need to buy the fish feed, and mineral hydroponics, of course, you need to buy the mineral solution, and if it's active, you also need to add oxygen to it. And of course, it doesn't hurt that you are also growing using bioponics and anthroponics technique. And in some areas, you might just have intermittent energy but still constant resources. Then you can do that passive mineral hydroponics. If you recall the image with the basil growing in the Coca-Cola bottles, that's an example of a passive mineral hydroponic technique. But as we go through the peak of a pandemic, where we only have now access still to constant energy but some intermittent resources, that's when we transition our cultivation method into bioponics and anthroponics. This is assuming that we have already run out in some way, or we are beginning to run out of the mineral salts in the fish feed, so we have to start producing more using food waste and human urine. And at some point, we will have only intermittent energy and no resources. And then we might try to grow using decoupled anthroponics method, which means okay, you don't have energy all the time. When you do get some energy, you use that energy to transform your urine into a processed urine that you can use, or your food waste into some sort of vermicompost powder, for example, or some vermicompost leachate. And then once you run out again of energy, then you can add that urine and that leachate or that powder into your systems, your anthroponic systems and your bioponic systems, respectively, to grow the plants. And of course, at this stage, you should also be growing significantly with organic agriculture. But at some point, you do reach the end of the pandemic where you have access to no resources or energy. And then you have to focus all of your production in permaculture and organic agriculture. We assume that at the end of a pandemic is a very stressful time for society and there's very few resources available. And it has been that case throughout human history, and the only thing we had available at the time was soil. So that's why we suggest to do organic agriculture during that time. Now, we have also written here a bit more the steps that you should think of in each stage of the pandemic, in each phase of the pandemic. So, in the beginning of the pandemic, the first thing you should do is to buy or gather the materials so that you can grow using any technique or the preferred one that you want. And here we have a list of things that you can go through. You should get plastic containers for growing and also plastic containers for biological processes. And when we say plastic containers, we mean basically anything: buckets, boxes, bottles, anything you can find. You should also have some sort of container to store necessary liquids. These are liquids referring to the biological processes that you'll be doing. Of course, you should get some sort of rubber or plastic pipes and connections for when you set up all of these different cultivation systems. And air and water pumps as well as air stones are important parts of hydroponic cultivation methods. You should also buy mineral salts and mineral solutions so you can stock up and grow them and grow the mineral hydroponics. Finding appropriate plant grow lights is important if you don't have access to a lot of natural light, which is the case for most of us living in cities. If you are thinking of doing aquaponic cultivation, you should get, of course, fish fry and fish feed and high surface area material to do those biological processes where you cultivate colonies of microorganisms to transform the nutrients that are locked in some form into a plant available form. And this high surface area material is, of course, also used for bioponics and anthroponics. And yes, you also need to buy the seeds of all the plants that you are planning to grow. You should also find the waste processing organisms that you want to use. These might be the red worms that we have mentioned for vermicomposting, but it can be other organisms such as black soldier fly larvae, which eat food waste and convert that into larva protein that you can eat yourself or you can add to fish feed or other animals. And then the bokashi macroorganisms that I have mentioned before are also part of these organisms that you do have to buy. You can't just find them anywhere. You can also get chemical products to change the water pH. This is particularly relevant for cultivation without soil because you have a lot of water and the chemistry of the water is constantly changing, so you might need to adjust it to optimize your food production. Here I added lime and phosphoric acid. These are two of the ones that are fairly common to find and easy to use and not very dangerous. You should also be buying soil as a backup and to grow plants in the future, and string, rope, nets, and other useful construction material to aid during your cultivation. If you do have the extra budget, we can recommend that you could get some pH and oxygen meters, some chemical products for pest control that are compatible with organic growing, and or predator insects for when you get a pest. But we do have to mention that when you are deciding which materials to buy or which materials to gather or to build, you should give priority to vertical cultivation methods because these are more efficient in terms of space, and most of us have limited space available for growing. To give you a bit of a personal example, in the beginning of this current pandemic, I thought to myself, okay, how can I simulate the steps that would be needed that I have just described to you? So I searched around my house and I found a bunch of buckets that you can see in the picture, an old aquarium, and some lights. So I set it up in a little corner of my house and I started adding water, mixing nutrients. In one of the buckets, you can see there's some gravel and a pump. So I started a bit creating a colony of bacteria that I can then use to convert organic waste into nutrients for my plants. But you do have to be a bit creative in trying to find things that you can use to grow. there's many things you can use to grow that you are not aware of at the moment. Sometimes when you see videos of people doing hydroponic at home, you see this very fancy equipment, but you can grow hydroponically in any basic container that can hold water. Still in the beginning of a pandemic, the next step is to kickstart the biology. So you should build or find the containers for the different biological processes that you will do. And you should start those processes. These can be composting, vermicomposting, and nitrification in parallel with other processes or not. Like I said, nitrification converts some form of nitrogen into another form. And this is a very simple process, but it can take a while to create enough bacteria colony that you can convert everything that you want to convert. So we do have a tip for you, which is to get water from an already cycled aquarium or aquaponic system to accelerate your own nitrification. This is because if you do nothing, it can take up to 6 months for you to build an adequate amount of bacteria for what you want to do. Next step, you should prepare the soil and start seeding. And of course, you should have adequate spacing and a number of seeds per hole. And lastly, you should build or find the cultivation systems so that in the next step, you transport the seedlings to those same cultivation systems. Now we enter the peak of the pandemic. And the first step here is that you should have the priority of using cultivation techniques with the scarcest nutrient sources. And these are aquaponics, which require fish feed, and mineral hydroponics, which require the mineral salts or the mineral solution. Now, we say that you should prioritize these two, not only because you may not be able to find those nutrient sources again, and these are usually more complex systems, especially aquaponics, that you need energy and resources. But also these two systems are the ones that are the most well known. They have the most information available online and are the most tested, which means if you do have a problem, you can easily find information to help you fix your own problem. In contrast, the other sources of growing, such as organic hydroponics like bioponics or anthroponics, they don't have so much information available. They're more experimental, which can result in less harvests during your experimentation process. That's why they are next in the priority in our opinion. And of course, the more traditional forms of cultivation, which is soil cultivation, they use more water and they take longer to grow. So that should be pushed as a last resort, so to speak. Now the second step is that during the peak of this pandemic, you should keep converting the organic waste that you produce into nutrients while you still have access to the energy. And these include converting the food leftovers into the leachates or the vermicompost, dried and crushed, into a dust, or converting the human urine in processed and nitrified urine. As a third step, you should start seeding already in the compost that you may have produced, or the vermicompost, or the bokashi compost, or the soil that you purchased previously. And finally, the last step of the peak of this pandemic is that you consume the final animal protein that you have if you're doing, for example, aquaponics and you're growing fish. Then we move into the end of the pandemic, the most stressful time of the whole ordeal, because we have very little resources and energy available around us. And so the priority here is that now the cultivation techniques with the scarcest nutrient sources are the vermicompost leachates, the vermicompost dust, the bokashi compost leachates, and the processed nitrified urine. This is because at the end of the pandemic, you have already used all the mineral nutrients. You have already used the fish feed and you've eaten all the fish. So now you have to use these other methods first until they run out. And when they run out, then you just do maximum cultivation in soil. That's the second step. But when you do cultivation in soil, you have to pay attention to insects or fungus. Because in soil, a lot of insects can hide, they can lay their eggs and they can hide easily. So you can have a lot of pests. And the same with fungus infections for your plants. So you have to have attention to that and you should be alert and take the necessary steps to prevent or mitigate them. Lastly, Once you are doing maximum cultivation in soil and you have harvested all the other crops from your hydroponic techniques, including organic hydroponics, which should have been the last you were doing, you should try to reuse that water from those previous cultivations to water the soil that you are now growing on. Before we move on to the next step of the presentation, I thought I should share with you some of the useful skills that you should think about learning for yourself for those times where you are trying to cultivate or grow plants during a pandemic. And these include how to preserve your harvests long term, because it can happen that you produce too much of one crop and you don't want to eat it all at once. You want to preserve some for the future, or you just have so much space available that you just grew too much and you do want to preserve that so your effort wasn't in vain. Some of the ways that you can preserve include drying your harvest, freezing, fermenting, pickle, and preserving in vinegar. Another useful skill that you can have is to identify alternative and safe sources of nutrients for your cultivation methods. The sources of nutrients we already talked about here, these are only the ones that we and I know about. There may be others that you might discover for yourself that can be safe for use. Some ideas that came to me include wood ash, include using the black soldier fly larva as fish feed or animal feed. This is something I have not personally experimented with, but we know it works from other people trying it. You can also use duckweed as fish feed or animal feed, and azolla that we have a picture of here as fish feed or animal feed. And the last useful skill, or one of the useful skills that we thought of that you should know, is to also identify different plants and organisms, alternative ones, that you can eat yourself. The ones that I already mentioned here, duckweed and azolla, can be eaten by humans, especially if you grow them in a very safe way where you know what's going into those plants. If you're doing aquaponics, it is possible to also grow alongside the fish, crayfish, and freshwater shrimp. And there are many aquatic plants that you can grow in the hydroponic techniques, such as watercress, wild celery, and Indian lotus. So now you might be thinking, okay, I am interested in growing, but I am living indoors. I don't have so much space available. Is there a way that I could prioritize things? And yeah, we did think about this also for you. We have developed here a list of methods that you should prioritize about how to grow indoors in your own house. And these are based on my own experience growing indoors. And this will, of course, depend how many resources you have to buy materials, the space available in your own house, how your house is located in regards to the sunrise and the sunset. So the first step, the first thing that we think you should prioritize is to try to grow vertically near windows or with natural light. And that's the first picture we have here in the bottom left. In my previous apartment, I had a big window and I added some vases that you can see, and I was growing hydroponically in those vases. I was growing some, I believe it's some herbs like parsley and coriander. And because we had adequate sunlight there, it was possible to grow them very easily. But it might not be your case that you have a big open window where you can grow. And that is currently also the case in my apartment. And that's the second picture in the bottom. In my apartment, I chose instead to go with the step 2, to grow vertically in a place where I can concentrate an adequate amount of artificial light. So you can see there is some sort of container there, some containers that are stacked up, and there is artificial lights on top. So I was able to grow lettuce, basil, and other herbs in that little corner. It's a corner that doesn't have a lot of natural light, so I had to add the artificial light. And then, of course, the next step in your prioritization should be to still try to grow what you can with natural light, but just grow it horizontally. And that's the example I have in the next picture, which is my first and former aquaponic system. It's a very small aquaponic system. I was not able to grow fish for human consumption. I just had ornamental fish. And this system is a bit more of the steps 3 and 4 in the sense that part of the system, as you can see, is very close to the window and has access to a lot of light. But on the left side of the system, there was not so much light. So I had to add some sort of artificial light to have adequate lighting. And lastly, if you don't have any other resources available, you should just use any container or bucket or bottle that can retain water. And an extreme example of this is the last picture on the bottom right. That was a bell pepper that I was able to grow in a 1.5 liter bottle using mineral solution of hydroponics. A very simple process, passive process. There was no aeration or air pumps or energy involved. And you can see there's actual bell peppers. I was able to eat that. The plant was able to grow in that small space. I mean, it's not a pretty place to grow. As you can see, there's a lot of algae in the liquid. There's a lot of green color. That's because I didn't cover the bottle from the natural light. And that algae is stealing nutrients from the plant. But still, I was able to grow the bell peppers and I was able to eat them. Now, the next question that we think is important for you to know is what should you grow and when exactly in each stage or in each phase of the pandemic? And we think that in the beginning of a pandemic, it's ideal that you don't have to go so much to the supermarket if you can avoid it. And the things that last the least should be the least time, that are more perishable, so to speak, are the things that you should be growing first. And these include herbs, salads, and some vegetables. And we have here a list that includes lettuce, chard, arugula, basil, mint, parsley, coriander, chives, pak choi, cress, peas, beans, etc., etc. These are herbs and salads and vegetables that have not so many nutrients, but they're very good to add to your meals at home. Then, still in the beginning a bit, but already mostly in the peak of the pandemic, you should switch your production to less perishable fresh vegetables. That means they last a bit longer, they have slightly more nutrients, but still you cannot survive just from them. These include tomato, eggplants, cucumber, zucchini, strawberry, which is really a fruit, bell pepper, kale, cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage radish, beet, taro, onion, carrot, radish, etc., etc. The point here is still that you should go as little as possible to the supermarket, but still get some sort of nutrition from the production that you have. Lastly, in the end of the pandemic, this is when you switch again your production to tubers, to, to vegetables that can last longer and have more calories. Here we included in this category potatoes, sweet potato, sugar beet, cassava, parsnip, kohlrabi, turnip, celery, and ginger. And you might notice that we did not include some very staple foods like grains and rice. We don't think these are so adequate for our cultivation because you would need a lot of space to grow still very little. Each those plants, the grains and the rice, for each plant you get very little food. So if you are space constrained, and most of us are because we live in cities, then it's not the most recommendable crop to be growing. And how much should you grow? In one sentence, we would say as much as you can, as much as possible. Use all the containers you can find bottles, buckets, and available vases. But still, it will not be enough to become truly self-sustaining. And we have here an example with potatoes. And we chose potatoes because it's the food with the best compromise between calories and cultivation space. That means that each potato plant can give you a lot of potatoes and each potato has a lot of calories, so it's the best thing to do this exercise with. So we know that each human needs at least a minimum of 1,600 kilocalories to survive every day. And this is the absolute minimum. If you just eat potatoes for weeks or months, you will have a very bad health, and this is not recommendable. But this is the bare minimum. You can survive. And each potato has 77 kilocalories for every 100 grams. Each potato also usually weighs between 140 and 340 grams. Let's assume 240 grams on average. So each individual potato has 184 kilocalories. In other words, each person would have to eat 8 potatoes per day or almost 2 kilos of potatoes. And this may not sound like much, it's not so much a big amount of potato, but each potato plant only yields 1.4 kilos of potato. And if we assume a 6-month period, you would then need 270 potato plants to eat the production of 1.5 plants per day during those 6 months. So 270 plants, that's a lot of plants, and most people don't have the space for that amount of production. So the conclusion here is that the first thing you should be doing is to get supermarket reserves for things that you cannot grow easily in your house. These include the cereals, grain, fruit, vitamin supplements, normal food, and then you should grow in your house to complement your daily food. Unless, of course, you have a lot of space to replace almost all your meals. But most people don't have such space. So they have to focus first on getting the reserves they need during the pandemic. So we are nearing the end now. I thought I would share with you some free instructions that I have done as part of a project called Oikosol, where we try to create free instructions of useful sustainable technology. So here you can find step-by-step instructions to grow an aquaponics system, to grow a passive mineral hydroponic system, and to have your own vermicomposting system at home. These are all free instructions, and these are also open source, so you can share them, you can change them, you can edit them, you can do whatever you want. Lastly, I would like to say that we hope this video was useful for you, that you maybe learned something new that you haven't learned before, you considered something from a new perspective, maybe you were inspired to grow more food. And we know that we are living in difficult times now with this pandemic, but we think that you should maybe make the best out of this situation and become a bit more self-sufficient and try to grow a bit more of your own food. So we hope this video was useful and informative and that you were inspired in some way. And we also hope that you have good harvests in the future. Thank you for your attention.